Hey everybody. I want to start with a story. So many moons ago, I worked at Twitter. May she rest in peace. And it was early in my career. I was tasked with improving the accessibility of the iOS client, which at the time didn't really have any voiceover support to speak of. And if you're not familiar with it, VoiceOver is the screen reader primarily used by blind and low vision customers on iOS. So I'd worked on the UI accessibility framework a bit, but I hadn't ever really done any customer-facing work. So I searched all over the internet for the best way to do this, and I couldn't really find any good resources beyond the standard Apple basic documentation back then. So I just took my best shot. And I made each tweet an element for the screen reader to read out, and I gave each tweet a label and a value. The label was tweet. The value was the author of the tweet and the text. Now, if you know VoiceOver at all, if you've done VoiceOver work, you should be cringing. You should be like, oh God, because that was so wrong, so wrong. If you open an app called Twitter, an app filled with tweets, and you go to your home timeline, do you really need to be told that every tweet is in fact a tweet? No. You don't. And that's what I had done for our VoiceOver users. They got to hear tweet, blah, blah, tweet, blah, blah. And you can imagine they were not happy. And so I started getting emails, tweets, and things like that, letting me know what I had done. And thankfully, some of the folks that reached out, they had advice, they had ideas. They were like, here's how I think it should work. Here's what I would like to hear in VoiceOver. So using that great feedback, I removed the tweet label, propagated the other items up to the label, and the feedback died down. Things were better. Our users, our customers were happier. So why did I mess up so badly? What went wrong? Well, for one, at the time, Twitter didn't really have any accessibility team to speak of. And I didn't know, I was new, I didn't know who I could ask at the company about this topic. It was a young company, and I was the 7th iOS developer at the time. We didn't really have best practices in place, documentation, and at the time, Twitter didn't have a core value of accessibility or anything like that. You see, even with the best of intentions, in a world with the internet at my disposal, I got accessibility wrong. Because at the time, I was part of a company and a team and a culture that didn't necessarily prioritize it. Now, we had design resources, we had localization resources, we had product resources, but we didn't have accessibility resources. So if you don't know me, hi, I'm Summer, and I'm an iOS developer and accessibility specialist, currently working at Slack as the accessibility lead. I've also worked as an engineering manager on the iOS accessibility team at Apple, and I've generally spent the vast portion of my career focused on the accessibility on Apple's platforms. It's an honor to be here today to get to speak with all of you about my favorite topic in technology. So if you're new to accessibility, I'll start with the basics. Accessibility is the practice of making your software and services usable by as many people as possible. When we think about accessibility, we often break it down into 4 main areas: vision, hearing, movement, and cognition and learning. So on Apple's platforms, large text and VoiceOver are going to be technologies used by people who are blind or low vision. Closed captions and sound recognition are frequently used by those who are deaf or hard of hearing. People with motor disabilities may choose to use assistive touch or voice control, and someone with a cognitive disability might find guided access or the brand new assistive access to be useful tools. And while some of these technologies can stand alone and work on an iOS device without any work from third-party developers, others are different. Things like VoiceOver do require active support from you, the developers. Now, in the past, I've loved giving talks on those APIs, on how to make your app accessible. The thing is, a lot of us aren't actually working on our apps by ourselves. We might be working at a medium-sized or even a large-sized company where we just own a portion of the app, or even just, a button sometimes. And at those companies, much like my early time at Twitter, there might not be a lot of accessibility culture or resources, etc. It might just be a distributed labor of love, who knows? So then, how do you contribute to making your product accessible if you don't personally own the entire product? Well, that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to look at 3 questions. When I say an accessible product, what do I even mean? What is that grand definition? 2, what are models for accessibility within companies? How does accessibility work inside a company? And 3, what can you do as an individual to help build a culture of accessibility, to bring accessibility into your place of work more? Okay, so let's get started. Accessibility, when we're talking about a product, is 2 things. It's both a state and a practice. Now, at any given moment, a product can be completely accessible to all of its users. But in order to stay accessible, accessibility has to be a practice of the company and the people who build the product. So let's first take a look at the state, accessibility as a state. When a product is in its current form accessible, what does that mean? So let's go back to our 4 main ideas of accessibility, starting with vision. If we have an app that is visually accessible on iOS, that app fully supports large text sizes. It responds intelligently when text is resized. It reflows the layout and scales icons as well as text. It uses the large content viewer when needed, and it looks beautiful at any text size. Additionally, in the vision space, an app that is accessible fully supports voiceover, and that means labels, values, traits, correct item groupings, etc. And visual accessibility also means correctly handling numerous system settings, things like reduce motion, where you need to tone down animations or remove them completely when it's enabled. And finally, of course, this covers all things: color contrast, making sure things work for someone who is colorblind. So now let's move over to hearing. What is accessibility there? An app that's fully accessible from a hearing perspective captions all audio content. Now, this could mean closed captions for something that's pre-recorded, or this could mean live transcriptions. For example, Zoom and Slack both provide live auto captions for their call-like features. Apps that are accessible to the deaf and hard of hearing also don't signal anything meaningful with just sound alone. Sounds are paired with other things like visuals or haptics. And now we'll move to apps accessible to those with motor or physical disabilities. Those support voice control and switch control. And a lot of this support comes for free when you implement VoiceOver, which is great, but there are special considerations too. Additionally, there's things like tap targets. Tap targets need to be 44 by 44 pixels at least, according to the HIG. Platform gestures should not be overridden. New gestures should not be too complex. Multi-finger gestures should be avoided. There should be alternative tap-based ways to do anything that was a gesture. And finally, when we think about iPad, we want to think a little bit more about keyboard support and keyboard shortcuts and making sure those are robust. And now, over to cognitive. This is where we want to think about reducing distractions in our application. If our application has a lot of instructions or text, we want to think about reading level and keep that reading level low. Information density should be kept relatively low as well, and users should be able to customize things like sounds and notifications to best suit their needs. Also, things like timeouts should be avoided, and there should be error prevention and recovery built into the experience. So when we're talking about the state of accessibility right now, we are talking about everything I just mentioned and even a bit more. And that's what it means to be accessible right now. But what happens when the next version of your app comes out next week? Well, it's got to meet that same accessibility bar, but now it's running new code. So in order to be sure that your app is in an accessible state going forward, you need a practice of accessibility. Accessibility as a practice starts at the very beginning with product and design. When a new feature starts being considered, product and design should both be looking for areas that could be challenging for the accessibility space. For example, when Slack added the huddles feature, it was our product people and designers who called out very early, oh wait, this is live audio. We need to make sure we've got auto captioning here so this works for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Now next, the designers are going to get to work on specs for this new product. And these specs need to handle accessibility. They shouldn't just be one path, right? We want to think about the designs providing suggestions for different layouts when the text is small versus when it's very large. Designs should provide you with the right colors for high contrast modes, for people with color blindness, and also be considering things like information density. Now, once the specs get from design to developers, it's of course up to you, the developers, to implement these accessible designs well. But there's so much more than that, as you probably know. You'll need to think about things like data flow and architecture, making sure that the right information gets exposed to things like VoiceOver. And speaking of VoiceOver, of course, you'll need to be familiar with Apple's accessibility APIs so you can set those correct labels and values and traits. Now, larger companies might even have separate teams that handle things like UI infrastructure and the design system. And those are places where you'll want to be thinking about accessibility too. So the reason you want to do that is because if I have a UI framework and I can expose just the right amount of accessibility to my feature teams, then those feature teams have a much better chance of getting accessibility right away. Now, we also want to consider accessibility at the project and engineering manager level. These are the people who are going to handle the timelines and the milestones and all of that. Time to implement and test for accessibility has to be built in, just like we build in time for localization. And accessibility should be accounted for any success criteria in how you measure your features. And I just mentioned testing, so let's talk a little bit more about testing. There needs to be a robust testing process for accessibility. This can and should include some automation for the smaller things that can be automated, but more importantly, manual testing by people who are trained in assistive technologies and ideally, people who use them on a daily basis. Accessibility QA sign-off should be a requirement to ship, a non-negotiable. There should be a culture of accessibility feedback. And this can come at almost any phase in the product development lifecycle, not just QA. You need ways to engage people with disabilities throughout the process. Now, this could mean having focus groups very, very early on as you get ideas for features and designs. This can mean iterating with people with disabilities as you work on a product, and this can mean testing and getting feedback later. But it can also refer to customer support. So once something's out in the wild, you want to make sure that your customer support can gather feedback from people with disabilities, knows how the technologies work, and can share that feedback with you. Feedback from and listening to users is key to developing a product that can be used by those people. Now, the topic of people, this matters as well. Accessibility is also part of how you hire. Your company should strive for hiring people with disabilities and make sure that all practices include them. The hiring practices, the interview practices, all of that should be inclusive as well. And lastly, I want to mention leadership. A culture of accessibility can grow from within. However, in my experience, without leaders vocally championing accessibility as a core company value, it can't truly triumph. It's up to leaders to set the tone for what matters at companies. And that means the language they use, the practices that they set forth day to day, and what they choose to highlight. So for example, maybe a company has a hackathon. Well, then it should have an accessibility category so that a leader can go up on stage and announce the winner and share how important and cool this thing is. It can mean having accessibility in onboarding and in the career ladder as well, which points to a way of saying, this is important to us. This helps you grow your career as well as being good for our users. So leaders need to lead both by words and by the actions they implement at their company. So accessibility is a practice at every level of a company and at every step in product development. When we talk about our product being accessible, we mean that we have a practice at our company of accessibility work that keeps the product in an accessible state at all times. So now we have defined our accessible product. So let's talk about the people and structures behind how that product gets built and maintained. I want to cover 3 different models that I've seen in practice over my career. But before we dive in, just a few caveats. First of all, these are models at mid to large size companies. And secondly, I'm going to present them as discrete models, but you'll want to think of them more as places on a spectrum. And finally, this list might not be exhaustive. You might have seen other models for how accessibility is implemented. And if you have, I'd love to hear about them later. So that's out of the way. Let's look at our three models. We've got one end of the spectrum, centralization. We've got the other end, decentralization. And right in the middle, we've got the hub and spokes. So centralization, a fully centralized model of accessibility, generally means that a company has a core accessibility team. And this team owns accessibility of the product end to end and coordinates all of the accessibility efforts. This team has their fingers in every company pie. Now, generally, a centralized accessibility team will handle the basic design questions, product questions, and implementation of accessibility work. They'll also come up with features specific to users with disabilities. This team generally has a large amount of control also when it comes to when and how features ship. Now, a well-known example of a centralized accessibility team can be found at Apple. At Apple, the main accessibility team owns the accessibility of almost all of Apple's apps, not all of them, but almost all, and the frameworks that run on your iOS devices. They also write and ship accessibility features, such as VoiceOver, switch control, assistive access, etc. Now, even at Apple, there are some exceptions to centralization. For example, some teams own their own large text implementation and iterate separately with their own designers on things like color. But the bugs in those areas will often still funnel through that central accessibility team so that that team A can advise on those topics, but also so that they're aware of what might not be going well, where we're getting a lot of bugs, etc. Now, a centralized model has a few key benefits. Of course, it allows for great consistency. If I have an X button, that X button is going to have the same label, hopefully everywhere, maybe close. It's not going to be dismiss over here and exit over here and close over there. Another benefit of centralization is expertise. When you have a team of people working full-time on your product's accessibility, then they build a deep, deep understanding of that exact thing. And they also then become an incredible resource to others. Another cool thing that happens when you have people working full-time on the accessibility of your product is it gives space for innovation because they are steeped in exactly what the problem space is all the time. Now, of course, always some pros, always some cons. As the product grows, the team has to keep growing, right? We've got a scale problem here. And if the team can't grow fast enough, well, then they become a bottleneck. Or even worse, they get burned out. Another challenge is something I call breadth within depth. And that's because accessibility is a horizontal effort, right? It's across everything. So each member of an accessibility team will generally have to know a lot about many parts of the company's product or products. If my company ships 12 apps, well then, and I have an accessibility team with 3 people, well, each of those people needs to know the insides and outs of 4 apps, as opposed to just 1 for the individual app teams. Now, let's move over to the other end of the spectrum. We're going to go to fully decentralized accessibility. Now, this can take some different forms. It can look like a handful of accessibility owners kind of scattered throughout the company, or it can be a bit more intentional, maybe a designer and a PM that pair together to work with individual engineering teams and make sure that their features ship accessibly. But the thing that all these things share is that there's no core accessibility team that owns it. Rather, each individual feature team or product team owns their own accessibility completely. Now, this model of accessibility often comes into being more organically as companies grow. As legal requirements or customer feedback starts to come in, they'll try to solve that. And so a little pocket of accessibility over here will sprout, and then another one over here. Soon those pockets will start to network, and that will start to form this kind of organic accessibility team, a horizontal network across the company. And back when I was at Twitter, again, a long time ago, about 2012, that was what we had going on there, is that a few of us just started to get together and talk about accessibility. And very frequently, I find that this model will hinge on people who are very passionate about the topic, and they'll become sort of the de facto leads for that team. Now, in order for decentralization to work, there absolutely has to be process in place. Now, that process can look like accessibility sign-off on designs before implementation, or maybe some third-party testing that helps build consistency. But the point is, whatever the process is, it's what's going to allow these disparate parts to continue to coordinate and create some kind of consistency and standard across the board. Now, the benefits of this model are that it requires very little extra staffing. Now, execs are going to love that, of course. And it also means that ideally, if it's going well, every team gets exposed to accessibility. Every team has to think about it. And that's going to spread knowledge and culture about accessibility across the company. And I think that's always a good thing. But of course, there are downsides. Thinking about accessibility primarily on a per feature basis can lead to a lot of inconsistency, as you imagine, both in the process of how accessibility work is done and in the quality of the work. It can also mean a lot of repeated work where a framework level solution would have been more appropriate. Without strong requirements of accountability in place, features can even fall between the cracks and ship without accessibility at all. And additionally, there's little chance to benefit from the deep expertise you get of a full-time team. And as your product becomes more and more complex, things can get harder and harder to solve. Finally, there's an issue of education and training. If there aren't any experts around, sometimes third parties will need to be brought in to provide accessibility training. And while that's not bad, it does cost the company money, takes time, and can be challenging. So we've got one side and the other. Let's come to the center and talk about our third model. This is a hybrid, as you might have guessed, between these extremes that seeks to alleviate some of the pain points while keeping some of the benefits. The hub and spokes model. In this model, there's a small central accessibility team of experts. They tend to own the core accessibility features and frameworks. However, they don't own the accessibility of every part of the product. Rather, it's their job to advise and support and build solutions for the rest of the teams. Feature or product teams are still individually responsible for the actual work, but now they have this central place to go for guidance and advice when they need it. So hub and spokes is the model that we're moving towards at Slack. For example, our core accessibility team, we provide frameworks. One of them, for example, is something called a focused transition manager, and that's used by our web and desktop products. Focus on web and desktop is challenging, and this product is something that all the teams can use to handle keyboard focus movement. We also have on iOS a UI development layer called SlackKit, and that wraps accessibility, making it really, really easy for our feature teams to get accessibility almost for free when they are building features. The accessibility team also hosts things like weekly office hours and test fests, and we're working with leaders constantly to set goals for the company around things like bug counts and conformance to standards. So hub and spokes has benefits, of course, from both of the other models. You get expertise, as well as some of the highly directed and consistent technical accessibility work of the centralized model, along with a little bit lighter staffing requirements and more knowledge sharing like you get with the decentralized model. However, even in what seems like the best of both worlds, there's still going to be some challenges. There is still a scaling issue. It's just not as severe. The central team often gets a lot of help requests and support requests, and so as the products grow, you're going to be getting more of those, so you can still be a bottleneck. And because the central accessibility team is still quite small, there needs to be some process and overheads to both attach new spokes or new features to the hub, as well as to keep old relationships strong and keep the process going. And because in the end, each individual feature team owns their own accessibility, there still is more space for individual variation than you would get, of course, in a centralized model. So now, looking at all these models, you might be wondering, okay, well, what should I push my company towards? What should we be going for here? And the truth is, it depends. But I do have a hot take, or at least a strong opinion on the topic. I do believe that more centralization is often what's best for users, because it creates, in my experience, the highest quality and the most consistent accessibility work. It's also going to lead, as we talked about, to more innovation, and we need more innovation in this space. Now that said, different companies will benefit from different models. Decentralization can actually work quite well if a product is very simple, if it's built with stock UI kit or stock Swift UI components, because there's so much accessibility we get there already for free. And also, if that small, simple product is built by people who care a lot about accessibility, or there's a strong culture of accessibility, then it can work great. But as complexity increases, companies grow, and the problems get harder, then centralization can become more and more necessary to create good work. Now, regardless of the model a company has, it's really important that they're committed to it. So the commitment to the model is going to be key. Now, for a centralized model, that's a commitment to hiring and spending a bit more money on accessibility. For a more distributed model, that's going to be a commitment to oversight, process, more education. Okay, so at this point, we've covered how different styles of teams can help make accessibility a practice at a company so that said company can make an accessible product. So now let's talk about you, the individuals. What can you do to bring more accessibility into your company to improve the culture and values around this topic? So let's say you work somewhere that already has some kind of accessibility team going on. Well, they obviously are going to be a good place to start. Accessibility teams tend to run very lean in my experience. And so very often we are thrilled when someone wants to help out or contribute. So reaching out to this team, great place to start. For example, at Slack, we have a Champs program. And the way that program works is that if you're interested in accessibility and you come to us, we say, hey, come work for us for 1 or 2 quarters, and then go back to your team. And this is so great because everyone wins. We get extra engineering help, and then that person goes back to their team and shares the knowledge, shares accessibility with their team. We've had really great success with this. So if your company has a program like that, that's something to get involved in. If they don't, maybe you're the person to start it. Now, you can also ask the core accessibility team if there are other ways to get involved. Things like testing sessions, user feedback sessions, interest group meetings. They're going to know about all these things, and they're probably going to need some help with them. And they can point you to the right place. And if things like this don't exist and you think they should, well, then you can work with them to get them started. But most companies don't have a dedicated accessibility effort. So what do we do in this case? Well, let's start small. One of the best things you can do when it comes to accessibility is ask questions. Bring topics forward. Maybe you got some new designs. Well, ask your designer, what about high contrast mode? What about large text support? What is that going to look like? Now, at first, these questions might catch people off guard, but that's okay. You'll keep bringing them to the table. Maybe if people really don't know, you'll start proposing solutions. But the point is, you'll just kind of keep bringing it back. Keep that voice in the room. Another thing you can do as a rogue solo advocate is to simply fix accessibility bugs. Now, not just fix them, but show them off. Some folks might not be aware you support voiceover, for example. So showing your fixes can help get other people excited and interested in doing the same. Or maybe your company has a hackathon or a hack week. Well, do a project around accessibility or highlight the accessibility in your project. Talk about it, talk about why you did it, tell user stories to help people really engage with why this is exciting and why this is important. Now, gathering and sharing user feedback is another really great technique to raise awareness. For example, you can find reviews and posts from blind and low vision users of Apple products on a website called AppleViz. You can search for feedback for your product on Twitter, or you can talk to your company's customer support specialists about the type of feedback that they see coming in about accessibility. Now, after you synthesize what you learn, you can share it back to your team, share it with designers and product people. Highlight what's going well, let them know what users really like, and then bring up what's maybe not going so well and where you could use some help. But the point here is that you're elevating the voices of people with disabilities to help others learn from their stories and engage and want to work on accessibility more. And of course, the key to culture and culture shift is the people. So how do you get more people involved with you? One thing that I've seen be very successful is starting a monthly meeting to get together and talk about accessibility in an open forum. And these can start really, really small. A small group of you get together and watch WWDC videos or talks about accessibility over lunch and chat about them. But it can grow. You can start inviting people within the company that are doing accessibility to talk. Maybe someone fixed a really cool voiceover bug and they come and describe how they did it. Or a designer has a big interest in font accessibility and they come talk to you about fonts. And then it can grow from there. Maybe you start reaching out to other people from other companies. Like, hey, how did you do accessibility at your company? Can you come hang out with us at lunch and talk about it and do a Q&A? And these kind of things can grow into really great experiences for everyone to come and learn. And whatever you do, make sure you're sharing this. Even if someone's not attending the event, they should know it exists. It should be plastered everywhere. Now, let's say you want to take things up all the way to that leadership level, and you want to push for change from the top. So something that I've had success with is pairing a presentation about the current state of product accessibility with an ask for a specific change. The presentation will do things like summarize customer feedback, talk about your conformance to standards, talk about the process you currently have, and all of that story will lead to a very specific ask from your leaders. Maybe something like, we need headcount for an accessibility specialist designer. Now, if you are going to do this, it's very, very important that you talk to your management chain first. Talk to other stakeholders so no one feels thrown under the metaphorical bus. You want to make sure that everyone's on board with you going to leadership and making this request and even joins you in the room so that this is a united front asking for more accessibility support at your company. And one other large-scale thing you can do, if you have the time, is get a feature on the roadmap yourself. Sometimes the people deciding on the features aren't going to decide on accessibility features, but you can, and you can pitch it and push it, get it onto the roadmap, and see it through. Now, with all of these ideas, you might be wondering, okay, well, like, what do I pick? What do I actually do? And the point is, any of these are good ideas. All of these, I hope, are good ideas. But what matters is that you keep picking them. The thing with cultural shift and cultural change is that it rarely takes one gesture or one event. It takes repeated and consistent effort and sustainable work. One thing I'll never forget is my old manager at Apple telling me I had to be like a dog with a bone when it came to accessibility. And if you've worked with me, you probably know that I am. So with that, we've made it to the end of this talk. And as you leave today, I hope that you remember at least these three things. First of all, accessibility is both a state and a practice. Secondly, there are different models of accessibility that range from fully centralized to fully decentralized. And it is my personal opinion that more centralization leads to better outcomes for the users. And as an individual, there are so many ways that you can help bring more accessibility into your company's day-to-day culture. But the important part is that you try to involve others and you do the work sustainably and consistently. And with that, thank you so much for your time. I apologize for going a bit over, and I will look forward to seeing you all throughout the rest of the conference. Have a great time.